on this project, and the lead on this project. So it's a project funded by the Florida Department of Transportation, and the lead on this project from the University of Florida is Jacob Yan. I don't know if you have met him or not, but he is basically leading the University of Florida's Transit Research Center. I can't remember the exact name, but it's based in their College of Engineering. But Jacob has strong ties into urban planning as well. And so they graciously invited us. Lewis had worked with Jacob previously, I think at the University of Michigan, and they knew each other, and this study on mobility hubs is kind of an interesting line of research that now that we've kind of like finished this first project, which included both Gainesville and West Palm Beach, I think that there's going to be certainly more opportunities for this type of research to have an impact in the profession. And so part of the reason we wanted to have this particular meeting is so that way we can get professional input and feedback on the research. So I'll turn it over to Lewis, who's going to take us through a presentation, and then we'll be having more conversations with you all very soon.
Yeah, so thank you, John. I guess what I want to say about this is, this is a research project funded by the Florida Department of Transportation, and the focus of the research project was really on on two things: on the analysis process and the survey. And that's kind of why we're coming to stakeholder input very late in the process, because that wasn't the focus of the research. But we realized that if we could, getting stakeholder feedback on our findings is going to be really valuable. Of course, we welcome feedback at any part of the presentation, but really, I think the focus of the feedback should be at the very end, which is where I'm going to talk about recommended mobility hub locations and recommended mobility hub amenities, and that's based on all the research. But we know that there's on-the-ground knowledge, and there may be plans that we did do a plan review, but there may be plans that we missed, and therefore, you all may have some on-the-ground knowledge about appropriate mobility hub locations that were not captured in the process we have. I do want to invite people. This is a kind of a long presentation because I'm going from the very beginning to the very end. I've tried to pick out just the highlights. If people want more information, we will have a report, but we won't release that report until FDOT approves the report, which will be a couple of months. But if at any time you have specific questions, feel free to just jump in. Don't wait till the end, because it is a long presentation. So what do I want to cover today? Talk about the project and the project objectives, go over the basics of the algorithm we use to identify mobility hub locations.
Lewis, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I noticed that Brian Ruscher, I think, joined us. So I just wanted to acknowledge that he's now also here in the audience, and he's with the Palm Beach TPA.
Howdy, everybody. Sorry I came in late.
Brian, I just want to reiterate what I just said, which is feel free to ask questions at any time. Don't hold your questions to the end. I realize one thing that's missing from this presentation, which is a definition of mobility hubs. I'm not sure. Should we go into that? It's kind of its own topic.
I think you should. I mean, for us, there's a state statute that defines mobility, like locations where TOD kind of is required, or like different laws. So, Larian, did you want to mention?
Well, the only thing I was going to say is, what is your definition of mobility hub?
Yeah. So maybe I'm going to stop the presentation for this, because this I've been on this project so long, I didn't think about addressing that fundamental aspect. But basically, the way we've been framing mobility hubs is investing in multimodal infrastructure in transit station areas and in infrastructure and amenities to improve the waiting experience for transit customers. So there's really two focuses: is improving the multimodal connections and improving the waiting experience for transit customers. So those are really the two focuses. And the full report goes into detail into best practices done in other locations of how you design mobility hubs. And we identify actually 3 levels of hierarchy: regional, district, and neighborhood mobility hubs. And then, as I'm going to go into in a minute, the main focus of the project is to create an analytical process for identifying mobility hub locations, the best mobility hub locations, and then taking those recommendations and putting them through a survey and getting responses from local residents. How did they react to that survey? So let me go back. Well, let me pause for just 1 minute. Any questions about what I just said?
No.
Thank you. Okay. So I'm going to talk about the project objectives briefly, the algorithm, again, briefly, the survey results, the plans that we reviewed and what we ascertained from the plans. And then finally, at the end, I'll talk about recommended mobility hub locations for West Palm Beach and recommended mobility hub features for West Palm Beach. And, of course, we welcome discussion at any point, but I think that's maybe where the most fruitful discussion will occur. The title of the project: Leveraging Mobility Data Analytics to Inform Mobility Hub Development in Florida. So a lot of it is about creating an analytical process with existing data to identify potential mobility hub locations. And this is completely funded by the Florida Department of Transportation. So our first objective was to create this process and to test it in 2 locations. We tested in Gainesville as a small city in a rural area, and West Palm Beach as a larger city in a metro area. So ideally, this process could be applied to any Florida city and perhaps any city in the United States. So our first objective was to develop a data-based analysis process that, through existing data, identifies suitable mobility hub locations. The second objective was to conduct surveys with transit riders regarding what they thought about mobility hubs. Were they interested in them? What features did they want in them? And then the third goal is to actually recommend specific mobility hub locations for the 2 cities that have been identified: Gainesville and West Palm Beach. So first, I'm going to go over the algorithm. What actually does the algorithm look like? I'm not going to go into a great level of detail. I'm going to say at a pretty high level. And this is a very new approach in the sense that previous algorithms have been developed, but they mostly analyze districts. We're actually doing something different. We're analyzing bus stop at the transit stop level. So the first thing we do is we cluster stops together. If they're basically within a short walking distance of each other, we cluster them together into a single node. So, if you have one stop on one side of the street and another stop on the other side of the street, and maybe 2 other stops on the other 2 intersections, that's not going to be, we're going to cluster those together as a single node. Then we create a buffer area, which is basically the catchment area, excuse me, the catchment area for the transit stop, and we do all the analysis on the catchment area. We score on 5 criteria. The next slide covers what those criteria are. Each of those criteria actually has multiple measures aggregated together. And then we weight the 5 criteria. We either weight them equally or we weight some of them more highly than others. And then basically, based on this score, we recommend mobility hub locations, and even to some extent whether they should be regional, a neighborhood, or district location. So of course, the key, why am I not going forward? The key question is, what are the criteria, right? So these are the 5 criteria. These are the 5 criteria. Transit ridership and supply. So that's both how much people are taking transit to this stop and how much service is provided in this stop. First mile, last mile connectivity. This is perhaps the most conceptually challenging one. What we're really measuring here is when there are people who can't quite get to the stop. There's people who are maybe a half mile or a mile away, but they don't have other access to good transit stops. So it's kind of this we're trying to identify those locations that if we just had a little better multimodal connection, people might be able to make it to the stop. Infrastructure focuses mostly on pedestrian and bicyclist infrastructure near the stop. Sociodemographics focuses on equity, identifying high need populations and high equity populations. And accessibility looks at the accessibility to destinations by walking, biking, and by car. All of those are figured into the accessibility calculation. And then what do we do with these 5 criteria? Well, we start by weighting them equally, so literally 20% for each of the 5 criteria. And we also look at preferential weighting, which is you take one of these criteria and you give it 50% of the weight, and you give the other 4 an equal share of the remaining weight. So basically, there's 5 variations, weighting variations, on these analysis criteria. So this is the infrastructure, the bones of the analysis process, which is done mostly in GIS. Any questions here? And again, we can provide the full documentation when the report is released. So we tried this a couple of different ways for the city of West Palm Beach. We identified 50 mobility hubs at the county. Of course, the county is a very large scale. We identified 15 mobility hubs at the county scale, and we also tried 10 and 5 mobility hubs at the city scale, see if we got different results. And we also tried all the different weighting schemes, weighting the different criteria equally or more heavily. This is an important rule that's within this algorithm, is that we don't allow mobility hubs to be too close together. The idea is if 2 mobility hubs are too close together, you're basically within walking distance of each other, and they should be fused. So the criteria we used in this run was that mobility hubs can be no closer than 1.2 miles from each other. And that's going to come up later in the conversation. We didn't treat train or rail stops any different than bus stops. Really, it's about the frequency of service. It's about the level of ridership. It's about how many destinations are nearby. The mode itself doesn't have a factor. Okay, so this is obviously not the entire county. This is one of the county analyses where we did equal weights for the 5 criteria, and it zoomed out a bit from the city of West Palm Beach. And you can see that, well, you can see several things. You can see a pretty regular spacing of proposed mobility hub locations, and you can see that a lot of them fall just outside the boundary of the city. This was one thing that we were challenged with, was our target was to identify mobility hubs for the city, but in many cases, the city boundary is from a transit perspective, arbitrary. So this was one of the challenges in our analysis. I think we probably should have expanded the study area a bit. You can see, just for reference, you can see 3 tri-rail stations here. Lake Worth, West Palm Beach, and what's that one called? The one north?
Mangonia Park.
Mangonia Park, yes. Thank you. Then when we clipped those to the ones that were within the city boundaries, we ended up with 5. So these were the 5 that were recommended by the algorithmic process, and they were also the 5 that were shown to our survey participants. So these 5 places are Military and Hibiscus, the tri-rail station at West Palm Beach, Congress and Palm Beach Lakes near the Tanger outlets, and then two US 1 in the north, near the Northwood neighborhood, and one in the south, near the Palm Coast Plaza. So these are the 5 that were recommended by the algorithm. And of course, we're excluding places that were recommended outside the city boundaries, as you just saw. So that's the summary of the algorithm. Now we're going to move into the survey response. Many of you helped us promote the survey. We want to thank you for helping us promote the survey. I know many of you sent emails out to your colleagues and constituencies. It was basically open for 2 months in the spring of 2024. We got 1,274 responses. Interestingly, it seems that a lot of those responses were bots. And then we went through a validation process, and only 500 were validated. The survey responses were a bit skewed off the city population. They were disproportionately white, higher education, and middle-aged in comparison to city demographics. So I'm not going to present comprehensive statistics on the survey population, just some highlights. There was 68% white, 41% college graduates, and 28% age 31 to 40. All of those are higher than what you find in the city overall. We did see a wide range of household incomes, though few under 25K. 74% of respondents are employed full-time, so we think a lot of these people are commuters. 73% own a car, and 11% have no personal vehicle. So a significant number of, and then 26% of households, which means more than one person in a residence, have just one vehicle. So we do have people who have mobility constraints in terms of vehicle ownership. So there were many questions in the survey. In fact, I'm only pulling out some highlights here. The most common access modes for transit were walking and driving, but then after that, also common but less common were ride hailing, personal bike, shared bike, and circuit shuttles. We asked specifically about shared mobility, and the most common shared mobility modes were shared bikes, shared cars, and ride hailing. I was surprised by shared cars because I wasn't aware that there was a lot of shared cars in West Palm Beach. The other two aren't as surprising. The top 4 responses in terms of what people wanted in terms of transit improvements all really had to do with either more frequent or more reliable service. That was definitely the preponderance of the responses. Mobility hubs don't really help with that directly. They help with the other issue, which I'm calling distance and multimodal access. Those were also important, but rated a bit lower in terms of transit system improvements. This one is a bit surprising. About 30% of respondents said that they do use multimodal travel today. They use train and personal bike, or bus and bike, or bus and shared bike, or personal car and shared bike. So these are the 4 most common combinations that people are already using, which is, I was surprised that it was that high. When asked about these multimodal options, about half of people rated them as convenient, and only about 10% rated them as inconvenient. So most people think that these multimodal options are reasonably convenient currently. So the arrows here identify the potential transit improvements that mobility hubs could help with, which is basically distance to destinations and multimodal access. The next series of questions asked, what do you want to see in a mobility hub itself, right? What do you want the mobility hubs to look like, and would they be useful to you? And 80% said yes. They said that they would use mobility hubs if they became available, and 75% said that they would use public transit more with mobility hubs being available. In terms of infrastructure, really people wanted the full range of multimodal infrastructure, including bike racks, places for shared bikes, ride-hailing zones, parking for personal cars, parking for shared cars, and charging stations. And in terms of amenities, comfortable waiting areas, climate-controlled waiting areas, real-time information, and safety features were even more highly rated. About 80% of people rated those as important features. So, okay, I thought there was. Okay. So this, the blue shows the people who said they would use mobility hubs, and the orange says that they might use mobility hubs. You can see that in general, the level of interest in mobility hubs is very high. And this graph, which showed from the top down, it's showing, blue is very important, orange is important, green is neutral, and then red and purple are not important. It shows that in terms of multimodal infrastructure, really people wanted they wanted everything. We thought there might be some more differentiation here in terms of, this is what's most important to us. And what we really heard is that all of these are important. None of them were really considered unimportant. So I'll take a pause there. Any questions about the survey? I think we're moving along pretty well. Then the next thing we did is an existing plan review. This is the list of plans that we reviewed. So some transit plans, some corridor studies, some downtown plans. And we did a very narrow plan review. And what I mean by narrow is we really looked only for subjects relative to mobility hubs, right? So that has to do with, were mobility hubs mentioned in the plan? Was there a discussion of transit stop improvements, or was there discussion of multimodal connections? That's really all we were looking for. So this slide summarizes what we found. In general, there were not a lot of mention. I think we only found one plan that mentioned an actual mobility hub. This is kind of new lingo, and not a lot of people are using it yet. Transit stop improvements were mentioned in several plans, but not necessarily with a huge amount of detail or focus. There was one recommended mobility hub location, which is called the tent site. I think this is already underway. This improvement is already underway. And it was really seen as a regional mobility hub that would serve bus routes, a trolley, bike share, and car share services. So, and this is interesting because this wasn't one of the ones identified by our algorithm. Multiple people already acknowledge that there is already basically a functioning mobility hub at the Tri-Rail station, strong rail to bus connections. That doesn't mean that mobility hub couldn't be improved further. Several plans, as listed here, talk about increasing shared mobility and micro-mobility. And several plans mentioned bus stop improvements. And some of the things that were mentioned were shelters, bike racks, seating, trash cans, real-time travel information, and wayfinding. So all of these, from the mobility hub perspective, all of these kinds of features and amenities could be considered part of a integrated mobility hub improvement project.
Louis,
Also, yes.
sorry, I just wanted to, because you earlier had said that the 1.2 mile distance, what would come in later. I think that probably is part of the reason, because the tent site is within, that distance from Tri-Rail or, a downtown area.
Yes, that's right. And also, I didn't mention this explicitly earlier, but park and rides are also within the rubric of mobility hubs, because park and rides are places where people are shifting modes from driving to transit, and they're places where the wait experience is important, and therefore improvements to park and rides also fall within the rubric of mobility hubs. Brian.
Yeah, so we have a map resource that has some transit hubs that you'll probably want to look at. This is what we consider as kind of our definition. Generally, if it has 3 transfers or more between one stop. So it kind of lines up, but we also identify a few others. I'm going to put a link to that in the chat. So you'll be able to, it's one of the layers you can just go and turn on. But I will ask if in this presentation, we've had this, thing come up in the past. We're not a transportation planning authority. We have 0 authority, unfortunately. So if you could please make sure to correct that to agency in the previous slides. For clarity of future stakeholder presentations and whatnot. We don't want to give anybody the impression that we own or operate anything. On the second and third bullet there.
Yes, I see.
I appreciate that modification.
Yes, that's a very good point. Thank you for bringing
Thank
that
you. I appreciate it.
Some of what you, Brian, some of what you mentioned may come up at the end again. So we did actually look at that. The map from the. I'm trying to figure what's your acronym? PBTPA.
Yep, it is the TPA, but it is the agency. We probably are pretty closely aligned on the hubs. Just wanted to make sure you saw that was in there. It's also referred to in our 2045 transportation plan, but that's not that'll be pretty soon superseded by the map you have on here for Vision 2050. So I don't think it's worth going in and changing anything based off that. I do want to know, I know that the tent site at one point was pretty well acknowledged as a potential new transfer location in downtown West Palm Beach. I don't know if that is still the intent of that site and that property, which I know just broke ground. There's fencing around. Is that still something
So we don't know either.
right?
We saw this in some planning documents and we don't know the current state. And that was actually one of our goals, was to find out, hopefully from the stakeholders here, what the current state of that site is.
Which site are we talking about? I'm sorry.
It's a tent site. It's across the street, you know,
The tent site?
yeah, from Restoration Hardware.
Yeah, that property is currently under pre-development. It's there is clearance happening there right now. There is some question as to whether it's going to move forward, but so far the developer seems to be moving forward. He's provided indications to the city that he's moving forward. So,
But do the plans include a mobility hub?
no, that is strictly a commercial building. That is an office commercial building.
Right, so then this this would have to be updated.
So what I do have, and Armando, if it's okay with you, through the transportation demand management effort, I'm working with Jessica Keller and Alex Hansen, is a transportation demand management spreadsheet, which has developments with what they're doing. And some of that includes like bike shares, scooter share, where the
Right.
companies have, are you okay with me sharing that with the project team so that they kind of have an up-to-date list of what developments are doing which kind of
Yes.
mobility related items? I can
Yeah,
forward
that's
that
fine.
to
I'm
them.
familiar with that document. Yeah, you can share that.
Okay, thank you.
Is it, I think one of the things, and I think our project sheds some light on, but I don't know how it does, but you know, West Palm Beach downtown is relatively a small area. And, you know, you have the Tri-Rail station, which is the identified mobility hub, you know, from our data analysis and GIS analysis. Then of course, you know, you have other places in the downtown, like the Brightline station, right, which is, you know, a transfer spot. And then there's long-term plans for potentially light rail. I know the TPA, you know, had put out a potentially a light rail project plan. I know there were some meetings in the last 18 months or so that talked about a downtown mobility hub. And one of the things that I'm unclear on is like, where are those discussions? Like if let's just say, for example, if there were to be a new light rail line that would go to Wellington, like where would that terminate? Is there any idea? Like, would it terminate, you know, at the Brightline station, at the Tri-Rail station, or is it just not known where that hub would be located?
Go ahead, Armando.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, the only mobility hub concept that I'm aware of that been discussed in the past was the site we were just talking about, the tent site. That right now is not the case. So I'm really not aware of another site within downtown that's been discussed as a potential mobility hub beyond the existing train station.
And John, for our purposes, what the TPA has is we're calling it a visioning study because we're not technically what the Federal Transit Authority would deem as project development for a transit line. So we have a vision to connect State Road 7 Wellington Green to downtown West Palm. We did come up with some concepts for where stations could land. That's not to say that that's necessarily where they would go. The furthest east we brought the line was to about Rosemary Square in front of the convention center. That's kind of a logical termini for at least a stop. But the issue is we have to also figure out how we get across SFRTA's corridor with rail on rail interaction. That's very difficult to overcome in an urban setting without doing anything with grade separation. So we're currently looking at that still, and we're looking at other corridors like a connection from the airport to downtown, but those are visioning studies and they're beyond the scope of a 5 or a 10-year plan. So that they are kind of a longer term commitment. We have them in the long range transportation plan, but they're just that, they're long range studies for now.
Okay, perfect. That's really good information. Thank you all.
Okay, so basically what we did next is we took the results from the algorithm, the results from the survey, and the analysis of the plans, and tried to actually come up with specific locations for mobility hubs. Although there's a little more data, and survey data review here. Remember I mentioned 5 criteria that we consider. We asked the survey respondents which of these they think is most important, and they ranked most important transit stops with the highest number of ridership and transit stops with the easiest access to destinations as their top criteria. And then we also asked them, so we showed them these 5 mobility hub locations. We said, would you use this mobility hub location? And by far, the most said that they would use the Tri-Rail location. 70% said that they would use the Tri-Rail location. 49% said they would use the Congress and Palm Beach Lakes location. And then 46% said they would use the US 1 and 23rd Street location. 41% said they would use Military and Hibiscus, and 23% said they would use US 1 and Kern. So you can see there's different level of interest in the mobility hub locations we proposed. And then we asked them we gave them a map, and they could actually click their own location independent of our recommendations. And this is a heat map showing what they indicated. By far, most of the clicks are within downtown. And it's interesting because a lot of them aren't necessarily at the Tri-Rail station. So I think there was interest in more than one mobility hub downtown. And then the second biggest area of heat is the airport, which is something that actually came up in our discussions as well. Then you see a little bit of corridor activity on the Okeechobee and the Belvedere corridors, but definitely the overwhelming majority of these clicks are downtown, in the downtown area. So what do we take away from all of this information and this data? Downtown West Palm Beach may merit multiple mobility hub locations, although the current algorithm doesn't necessarily permit that because we space them within 1.2 miles or 1.2 miles apart. Sometimes an area that might be a suitable location for mobility hub doesn't necessarily have high transit ridership or high accessibility to destinations today, because it's planned, or it's something that where new service is planned or new infrastructure is planned. So the algorithm didn't identify the airport, but again in discussions with ourselves and with the survey participants, that seemed to emerge as a possibility. So just generally, and this is I think obvious to all of us who are planners, we have to not just analyze current data, but also look at future plans. Also, it seems that there's probably 2 different kinds of mobility hubs, one that's more transit stop oriented and one that's more park and ride oriented. So these are our actual recommendations. Again, this is all provisional. We're happy to make changes according to your feedback. Obviously we already have one thing that's going to change, which is the tent site is no longer viable. For regional locations, we recommend the Tri-Rail station and also the Brightline station, because that is a junction for regional connections, and the Palm Beach International Airport. For district mobility hubs, we recommended the tent site and the Palm Beach Congress and Palm Beach Lakes location. And then for neighborhood mobility hubs, Okeechobee and Military is actually slightly outside the boundaries, but was indicated by the corridor plan as a mobility hub location, and 2 stops on US 1, one north and one south, as more neighborhood scale mobility hubs. So I'm gonna pause here and see if there's any reflection on this list. Sorry, I just want to say one thing. So this column says, was it identified by the algorithmic process? This column says what plans identify this as a potential mobility hub. And this says the hierarchy that we're recommending. So this basically tells you where does this come from, right? Right, so like the Palm Beach International Airport was identified in the Vision 2050 plan, for example. Okay. And then the last recommendation is what amenities were recommended. A lot of these amenity priorities came from the survey. I won't read off every one of them, but and basically regional mobility hubs should have more infrastructure and amenities than neighborhood mobility hubs. Shelter and climate control, basically shelter should be provided at all of these mobility hubs, but climate control at the regional ones. Multimodal facilities for bikes, for private vehicles, for shared vehicles, for transfer areas for ride hailing and for circuit shuttles. The most important amenities that we heard from people were safety features, were real-time transit information, and phone and computer charging areas were all high priority. So basically, we organized this in response to the survey feedback and the existing plans, and the general idea that higher level mobility hubs should be prepared for more types of infrastructure than local neighborhood mobility hubs. But again, this is, I think, just an initial recommendation and could definitely be refined. Any thoughts on this?
This is Brian. We have some mobility hub. We call it a different term. It's basically a level of investment for 561 corridors, which is our kind of premium transit lines as identified in the LRTP. We'll send you those. Be interested for you all to compare notes. Let us know if any changes come from it.
That'd be great. I think, yeah, that's exactly what we're looking for is documents like that we may not have found.
We're also, I think, looking for your kind of feedback on this as a planning process, as a tool. My gut feeling, and maybe I'm wrong, but I think a lot of times we as planners, transportation planners, go with our gut feeling of where mobility hubs should be based on, like Tri-Rail station, that should be a mobility hub, right? Kind of makes sense, right? But, what are your thoughts on the usefulness of a more data-driven tool like this as a way to, try to, really create better connectivity? I know you all have different mandates in your jobs, and I know that there's really nobody here that, we're not like Transport for London where we can one agency just do everything, unfortunately. but the reality is that we need to coordinate in order to, create that connectivity. So, Lorraine can have connectivity into the Tri-Rail stations, and, the city can have connectivity from the neighborhoods outside of downtown into the downtown. And, Brian, which is more countywide in focus, could think about those regional issues. And so what are your thoughts on all of this? I mean, do you think that this process makes sense? Does it seem too quantitative and academic? What are your honest thoughts on all this?
I mean, one of the things that becomes difficult is just the locations, obviously. The locations identified, and we talked already a lot about locations and what are realistic, viable locations. And anywhere you're talking about South Florida, east part of any city, is just finding a spot where you could actually do something like this becomes a huge challenge, especially if there's not public land already available. So I think just paying more attention to where it's actually one of these mobility hubs could be possible based on available land It's something that we really need to dig into. Otherwise, we're just kind of creating maybe an expectation that something could be done when it's really not possible.
So the only thing I'd add is, and I'm sure maybe you've already looked into this with all the different plans. But to be sure that, right, we're taking into consideration all the future plans that are out there in terms of public transit connections. So if we're looking at, I don't know, light rail down Okeechobee, right? Or another corridor, that we're incorporating those future plans, because I would think those would sometimes drive the mobility hub locations. So I'm not sure, did you do analysis on all that legwork before?
I mean, we did a plan review, and
Plan review.
we pretty much did it exactly chronologically in other words, we did that last. We didn't start with that. We started with the data analysis process first, then a survey, and then last did a plan review.
Okay.
Which is not necessarily, if this was a urban planning project, that's probably not what we have done, but this was a research project. So,
Yeah.
our priorities were a bit different, but yeah.
Yeah, okay. I guess for me, the survey, I mean, like you said, you only had about 500 validated ones. It seemed limited. So that's a little, I think that's kind of a concern for me, that are we getting enough information? It seems a little limited to start with. And then the only other thing I would add under where you had amenities, when you talked about EV charging, hopefully we're looking at EV charging for bikes and scooters as well. You didn't get specific, but what we're seeing is, right, a lot of EV bikes, let's say, on our trains and scooters, and people are really using those for their last mile. So when we think of EV charging, we need to think of that infrastructure amenity as well.
I agree with the Rain and Armando, and I think Bernard even put a note into the chat. But the thinking here is that we have to start looking at this in more of a data-driven approach. And I want to know kind of the tools intent and applying and giving this to cities into the future as they can go and do this. Is there going to be like a guide that agencies or different organizations could use to analyze their own kind of characteristics and patterns over time? Or is it something where we're going to publish the paper and hope that it kind of takes on, like, what's the utility moving forward for different jurisdictions?
I mean, I think that's something we're thinking about now, right? We're thinking about what is the next project to make this more usable to localities and to transit agencies. But again, the focus of this project was on developing the data algorithmic process and then kind of field testing it, seeing, what do we get and how do people respond to it when we ask them. And I think, all the limitations that you all are bringing up, taking into consideration future plans, taking into consideration where is there available land, are completely valid.
The land question is something that I've been struggling with, because like when you go to European cities, for example, like Paris or London, they don't necessarily have a lot of available land, but they've figured how to incorporate a lot of mobility options into the street space, the public spaces. So a question that I have is, of course, if you have a major bus interchange, you obviously need land, right? But or if you have a railway station area, you either already have the land because you have the train station there, or if you're maybe building a new station, obviously you need that space. certainly for park and ride, but how important is land, I guess, right? Maybe it just depends on, we talk about regional versus district versus neighborhood mobility hubs, but maybe the typology needs to be a little different. Maybe the typology is land intensive mobility hub versus not land intensive mobility hub. I mean, is that something that you all thought about?
So, and I apologize. For some reason, I thought this meeting was at 1, so I joined a little bit late. So part of my ignorance is knowing the different variations of a mobility hub, like you just mentioned, regional, local, neighborhood. So yeah, I think if there is a small footprint type hub that serves a neighborhood, for example, then maybe that could be incorporated into a streetscape. And I saw one of the locations in the presentation was US 1, and I think it was 23rd or something like that. So I believe that's a Broadway corridor. We're working with FDOT on a future redesign of Broadway, so that would be an opportunity potentially. Or even, as Brian was saying, we have a listing of private developments that are in the pipeline. There could be an opportunity to work with a private developer, and the city provides some kind of incentives for mobility hubs that may be a little bit larger and larger footprint if we can incorporate that into the development. So yeah, I think there's opportunities. I just don't know enough about the different types of mobility hubs to kind of speak to it in a way that that's educated and informed. But yeah, I think there could be an opportunity for sure, depending on the footprint.
And just kind of thinking about the different types of transit that are out there. If we are talking about SFRTA, that's a regional commuter line. We're working on developing the Northern Layover Facility. Lorraine and I are in constant contact about that one. But as we start to think about things like light rail and streetcar, bus rapid transit, these different uses also have operations and maintenance facility requirements. And if we're thinking about the mall at Wellington Green, for example, is a great example. We'd love to have a light rail station that pulled up to a future redevelopment. Is that realistically feasible given what we know about like end of line facilities and otherwise? Like we have to plan for that too, and think about those things when we start thinking about TOD, because that is an extension beyond, what the typical TOD framework is. And that is actually, while it might not necessarily impact the TOD framework so much in terms of the immediate surrounding, it does impact how we can do things and how we integrate these things together. Ultimately, the transit project should be put in place and the development should chase it. That's not always how it works. But that's, in a perfect world, that's how it's starting to shape up in places like Philly and Austin and Phoenix and otherwise. So I'm really curious about, the chicken versus egg argument for some of this stuff too, and how this study can help get to that answer. In my mind, like what you've picked also lines up very well with how we're thinking in the 2050 plan and framework, but we're having that issue of the land intensity and how much we can do and get into local and county planning efforts to make sure that they're also in line with what is proposed.
I'm not sure how what I want to say relates to, Brian, what you just said, but I think some of the thinking about mobility hubs is about increasing access to transit stations through these emerging modes like what Lorraine mentioned, like electric bikes, like electric scooters, and therefore increasing the reach of transit with relatively low cost infrastructure, right? I mean, putting some bike parking in and putting some scooter charging infrastructure in is a lot cheaper than putting in a light rail line, right? So how I think that mobility hubs it's supposed to be a strategic proposition where we make transit and especially multimodal access to transit more attractive with significant investments, but not colossal investments, right? So that seems to me to be the big picture thinking here.
And I think we may be changing our ideas about what a mobility hub could be going forward. So like John was saying about in Europe where they in a very small footprint, can offer different options. I actually got to visit one of the original mobility hubs in Bremen, Germany over the summer. And I was surprised to find that what they call this mobility hub, it's not what I would have considered like part of the train station, but because they're used to walking further distances, where you can park and charge your vehicle and different kinds of vehicles. There was a solar charging station there for bikes. It was it wasn't, it was a bit of a walk, but they consider that part of the infrastructure of the station. And so, yeah, different cities have, of course, different options for that. People's commutes look different. But if you are charging a car all day while you're at work, maybe you're willing to walk, half a block, because it's that convenient and it makes sense for you. We don't know that. Those are also cultural shifts, right?
When you talked about neighborhood mobility hub, it sort of made me think of, I see a lot of neighborhoods here in West Palm, and even where I live out in Royal Palm Beach, where a lot of people are using electric sort of golf cart vehicles to get around. They're street legal. They've got their plate and everything and all their necessary equipment, and that's becoming more and more popular. And I could almost see where you'd have a smaller footprint hub that could be used for those types of vehicles along with scooters and electric bikes to get around a fairly small area and avoid some of the traffic headaches that larger vehicles bring. So yeah, I think we got to think out of the box and look at what are people beginning to gravitate towards for transportation, and how can we make it convenient for them to get out of their cars and get into these other kinds of vehicles, assuming doing that even addresses traffic or makes it worse. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, to me, an interesting follow-on project would be, given different space requirements, given 20 square meters or 100 square meters or 1,000 square meters, what mobility hub designs are possible, and what would be desired, right? Because it's that space I think it is that space constraint that's the main, that prevents us from having everything people want. Sorry, that was the last slide. The last slide is recommended mobility hub infrastructure, and we're happy to email. Serena, can you email out the slides? So at this point, it's really just whatever other questions or discussion we have. The presentation is finished.
Hearing me. Okay, so where do you go from here? What's next? What are your next steps?
Okay, well, so I mean, like our next step is to hand our finished report. We're going to make some changes according to the feedback you guys provided. Our next step is to hand the finished. It's basically 90% complete. Hand the finished report to FDOT. I think in terms of our next steps, what we should be thinking about is, can this recommendation document be used to help a funding proposal? To used as Gainesville's already done that. They've used their recommendations to get some, I think, some federal funding from the DOE to fund some of the mobility hub improvements that they want to get. So this document could be used as part of a funding proposal, or, as I was just saying, follow-on research project. What remaining obstacles are there to improving mobility hubs and planning mobility hubs, and how would we frame that in another research project that kind of addresses those gaps?
Got it. Louis, if you could add your definition of mobility hubs to the slides.
Yes.
That would be helpful.
And some images too.
That'd be good.
That's not
Bernard had
problem.
a kind of an important methodological question in the chat I wanted to address. So really, Bernard, the way we were able to solicit feedback were two ways. One is kind of like reaching out to folks like you all, the city, WPBGo, and others, asking you all to forward the survey to your constituents. And then the other way was an intercept survey that Serena and some of the grad students from UF, we came down and did intercept surveys at Tri-Rail. Lorraine, thank you for
Sure.
our Good Friday panicked text messages. We were booted from security from Tri-Rail Station until Lorraine helped us and got us back on the platforms. So we mainly did the intercepts. I think it was like mostly Tri-Rail and kind of in front of the Brightline area.
Yeah, so I think, John, I think now it's just, maybe we just thank everyone for their time.
Yeah, I mean, I do. I want to thank you all, but before we kind of all go on with our days, you know, I think that this overall arching, you know, kind of topic, okay, you call it mobility hubs, call it, you know, 15-minute cities, call it whatever you want to call it, right? These are things that we're all working on and dealing with on a regular basis. And I have to say, I was very disappointed when I asked FDOT a question about this, you know, like, how do they see this implemented? And it was a little bit kind of like, well, we don't really control anything at the local level, so we really can't do all that much, right? And so I think personally, a big problem is that, like, this issue's problem, you know, solving these problems for the commuter or the resident involves lots of coordination across different agencies and different stakeholders. You know, we've heard Brian say, we're not an authority. We don't have the authority to do anything, right? But, you know, they are the MPO. And a lot of times planners kind of look to the MPO, hey, just why don't you solve our problems? Get this done for us, right?
We would love to.
Yeah, you know, the city obviously is doing a lot. Tanika, I don't know if you are still on here, but, you know, you obviously, the DDA has done a tremendous amount of work in enhancing the quality of life and mobility options in the downtown. So I guess my question is, like, on one part, we are working on this for the downtown area, right? The harder question is, how do we do this in the not downtown area? You know, how do we think about creating mobility hubs in places that we've identified, you know, that are within that 15 to 20 minute, you know, transit ride from downtown over by, you know, whether it's the Broadway corridor or you know, out a little further west, out by, you know, Congress or the you know, the outlets. You know, that to me is critical, because the folks are being forced to move further west for affordable housing, and they're the ones that need to rely on public transportation. So how do we tackle this going forward?
Well, John, I think you're absolutely right, is that it's, you know, it sort of reminds me of the homelessness issue, and that it is a complex issue that requires a lot of different agencies to be at the table. So it is disconcerting that FDOT would kind of throw up their hands, because they control so many of the roads throughout South Florida. But, you know, as an example, you know, you're talking about out west. So if you look at the Okeechobee corridor, you know, half of it is the city's jurisdiction in certain areas, half of it's county, some of it's unincorporated. So all these entities have to kind of get together and plan out. And there's been some kind of very high level discussions, for example, on the Okeechobee corridor, about zoning and density, so that if there eventually was some kind of a light rail or some kind of mobility hub, that we'd have the appropriate zoning for that. We already talked about Broadway, that, you know, that would require FDOT to kind of be at the table as well and approve any design enhancements for some kind of mobility hub. We're doing a mobility plan update right now, and part of that includes looking at north-south routes for a fixed line that would better serve the north-south routes right now, to try to get people in and out of downtown. And so we're looking at where are the best places to put stops, and where is the density going to kind of be able to support that. But, you know, ultimately, you're right. We have to have a more coordinated effort. There isn't a WPBGo is a local effort that brings together a lot of different stakeholders, including the county, Palm-Tran, the city, and then private sector, as well as the TPA to go over transit and mobility issues within downtown, but that also includes getting in and out of downtown. And that effort kicked off, I want to say it's been about a year now. And it's gotten good traction, especially from the private sector, which is surprising. So we do have monthly meetings to discuss what are some strategies that both the public and private sector can pursue. What are some things that each stakeholder is already doing that enhances mobility in and out and within downtown. So there's some traction there, and I think if that effort grows, it can serve as sort of a catalyst to get the right people around the table.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you.
Hey, guys, I need to jump off. I've got another meeting at 1:30.
Yeah, we're over time. So
Thanks,
thank
everyone.
you all. We'll share all of this with you when it's available, and look forward to kind of continuing these conversations.
We'll do. We'll share our information with you as well. Thank you.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you very
All right,
much.
thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Serena and John, you guys want to hang on for like 3 minutes?
Yeah.
Well, that was good. I think we got some interesting, I really think the space issue really nails it in my mind.
How so?
And I guess